on air.
We are now on air. Thanks for joining us, everyone. This is Footnote number 11, 12, something. We've been on hiatus. We went to the Ontario Medical Students Weekend. It was a lot of fun. Had some great times. Met up with some of our older friends that we left behind as we moved on to this next part of our journey. But it was really nice catching up with them, and now we're back. So today, June has something very special he wants to share. This is like a June episode where he gets to share one of his crazy breakthroughs. So let's tune in. Let's see what you have to say. Go for it, June.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure. And I don't know where to start this.
Dive right in. I'm taking notes.
So I'll give you a sense of like some of the sequences of events that have been going on in my life. So this Thursday, I went to a seminar on psychedelics. It was basically like a 3-hour lecture given on everything related to psychedelics. So his name is Daniel Grieg. I think he's like I don't know what he is, but he's some young dude at U of T, and he's very knowledgeable about this kind of stuff.
Okay.
So in the seminar, he talked about historical uses of psychedelics, which I've, kind of shared with you too. Some of the theories behind psychedelics, the current neuroscience of psychedelics, and this seminar is going to be a 4-part series. So there's going to be you talk every week. He also talked about the connection between artificial intelligence and machine learning to what we understand about psychedelics. So I thought it was one of the most well-researched and vastly broadly spanning talks that I've ever been to. So I just found that fascinating and so enthralling. And so, I was in this intellectual high almost, because that's just so cool and compelling to me. So much so that when I raised my hand to ask a question, I was shivering, shaking in the inside. That was quite an experience.
Yeah.
And on Friday night, I sustained an injury, kind of an injury. It's healed a lot now, but I was playing basketball and I just fell flat on my right hip. So I couldn't walk for the day. So all of Saturday I stayed in, and I was like, oh, what should I do this day? And so I decided to take one brownie that I made out of some marijuana brownies. And usually 1 square, it's a tiny bit. I've shared some with my friends. They've reported 0 effects from 1 brownie, but for some reason that was a sensitive enough dose to get me, I don't know, propelled into this thought spiral, this mystical thought spiral, let's say.
Okay.
And coming out the other end, it's made me a Christian.
Christian.
You
converted?
Well,
were you already?
I was a pseudo Christian.
Okay.
But something let's say my threshold was passed. My threshold of belief was surpassed.
Now you're a believer.
And I'm a believer. Yeah, it was something like that. But that means a different thing to very many people.
Okay.
And when people say I am Christian, I think that provokes somewhat of an allergic reaction nowadays.
I'm coughing.
It's yeah, there's the allergy. It's oh, you're a Christian. Oh, it's you poor ignorant soul, blind to the advances of modern science, and
right.
So there's a lot of ridicule that goes along with that. But I think there's a way to reformulate the story such that it makes better sense. And
The story of, like, the Christian story.
the story of everything,
The
like
story. Okay.
like the beginning of the universe to now.
That's a big story, June. Lots of characters.
Yeah, it's a big story.
Lots of events.
That's why I have to condense it a lot.
Okay.
Um, and I'm probably not gonna be able to go through it like chronologically. Just gonna bring in bits and pieces that I can kind of toss to you and see what you think about it.
Okay.
All right.
I love these sessions.
All right. So it's story time. So imagine, let's imagine. What should we imagine? Imagine that you're a god.
Okay.
And kind of, you are everything at every point, at every time. And you're like infinite and like super cool.
Okay.
And you're like, I don't know. Maybe there's a question like, I wonder how this all started, or like, and at that point begins the universe.
Okay.
At that point, something about like the principles of the universe that like are get it to arise just happen at that moment for some reason or another. And the universe starts, the Big Bang, things like shit happens for some reason. It just goes. You have the formation of quirks and quarks, and then they arrange into like atoms, and the atoms arrange into like more complex atoms, and the atoms aggregate, and you form like planetary bodies and stars and blah blah blah. That happens for like 11 billion years until you get planet Earth. With planet Earth, you get the same kind of thing going on. Things following their natural order. They're like governed by the laws and principles of whatever there is, and it keeps going and going, going, and it's and then you get the formation of something like life, the first unicellular organism. And there's a idea in complexity science that's something like the organism and the environment are paired.
Okay.
So there's a coupling between the two. The organism, let's say a single-celled, like a single-celled microbe, will adapt to its environment, its environmental niche. And when there are changes to the environment, like the availability of like oxygen, let's say, changes, that thing will morph and evolve to match that environment, right? So in a way, it mirrors the demands of the environment.
Okay.
So there's a strange process that happens as organisms evolve. It's like you're adapting to this like fundamental reality, like just of the environment and everything. And you get better and better and better at it as you go along, right? Which makes sense. Like that's how selection works. If it doesn't work, you get cut. If like an organism discovers something that is like a very valuable, like an innovation like DNA or like the Krebs cycle, that's like going to be wildly like successful because you've somehow through chance or whatever harnessed like the principles of the universe to work in your favor. And so you have like a mirror version of some of that within you, contained within you, like even if it's like a single-celled microbe, right? And so you can imagine this happened like 3.7 billion years ago, which is like maybe the only thing I learned from my microbiome course that I took last year. study for your exams, guys. But so you have the rise of these like single-celled organisms, and if you talk to me about like complexity science before, these one complex, adaptive system form like units with other and form communities of complex adaptive systems. So one example of a multicellular complex adaptive system is the slime mold. You have a lot of individual slime molds coming together, and then just by the virtue of their placement and their communication with one another, some of them function like the eyes of the superorganism. Some of them act as like the digestive tract. Like it's a very cool process, and it emerges like right then and there. Anyways, you continue this process of evolution and selection that harnesses the fundamental principles and properties of the universe to work in its favor. And after 3.4 billion years or some like crazy amount of time like that, you evolve this hardware called like Homo sapiens, right? And like Homo sapiens is really unique because we're like the first bipedal creatures to walk on this earth. Like you can roam anywhere. Humans have sweat glands and can outrun like, I don't know. We're very extremely mobile, so we can go anywhere we want, and that's because we have reduced fur and like sweat glands, so we don't heat up and die like when our ancestors used to chase zebras for hours and hours, and then they would die of exhaustion, and the humans would get to eat them. Anyways, we have a lot of remarkable adaptations that really make us kind of like imagine like we're the Goldilocks of the Goldilocks of the Goldilocks of the Goldilocks of Goldilocks of like the animal kingdom. Like that is how adaptive we are. But a more like fascinating part of our like the most fascinating part about our like what adaptation is our brain. And so like the complexity of the brain and like the human body, I think, as I've been learning, like studying through medical school, is like absolutely mind-boggling, right? So I've searched this up. We have a collection of 37 trillion cells. So 37 trillion of those, you know, 10 to the power of 12 of those like tiny little microbes, all kind of working in harmony with one another to produce this being. And it all seems to support like the head. 80% of our blood flow is directed to like the functions of our brain. I'm gonna have to fact check that, but I'm like fairly confident. Like in any case, the point is that we have this like mega city like super organism supporting this, and the like so at the psychedelic seminar there are also comparisons between like AI machine learning algorithms and like the brain. The design is very similar. Like the way that AI now was developed was developed by looking at how neurons connected and fired and wired together in order to produce something like intelligence. And that's a question like we have no idea how it works, but we know that it like far, far, far surpasses the current like computational technologies that we have today. So like how I imagine the human brain, which I said to you, like the connections in it are more numerous than the number of atoms in the entire universe, is you have this incredibly sophisticated like biological supercomputer that you are living in. So it's this miracle of this creative force that's been driving to some direction, harnessing the principles and things that help organisms thrive, like paired to its environment, and then we get this. So like the first idea I wanted to get across to you was that like this is a this is like a miracle. And like imagine if you were like a bodiless god, just some spirit,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of fell asleep and you woke up to a new body, and I asked you the question like before you wake up, like, oh, what kind of body would you like to inhabit? What would you like to be born to?
Mm-hmm.
If I think about that question, like this body that I'm residing in now, like that possesses like these dual core like super opponent processors, like that far surpass the computational abilities of like modern day computers, like and can like act and feel and sense in like 5 different or maybe 10 different modes. Like that's a pretty good body to be born into if you're that like, you could have been born as like a chihuahua or something, but
Right.
so so like that's pretty blessed.
Mm-hmm.
And well, okay, before I go on, and any
Mm-hmm.
thoughts?
Well, I want to clarify that point. So you're asking me, well, you're not asking me, but you're toying with the idea that God gave us a gift. Is that sort of the idea, or is it that we're one with God?
Oh wow. Well, I could see you could see it in both ways.
Okay, both of these things have been discussed in early modern philosophy before.
Right. So what was the first point that you were making?
So are we a gift of God? That's the first one. And then
Hmm.
the second one is, are we of God? Are we still a part of him now?
Uh-huh. Like these discussions get very tricky about like
Yeah,
the words and like what God means, but
right.
are we a gift of God? I mean, if you conceptualize God as this like all infinite field of, I don't know, potential and consciousness from which
Mm-hmm.
like life arose,
Mm-hmm.
and we like reflect that by virtue of being created like within that environment. Yeah, maybe we are a gift,
Mm-hmm.
but there's part about us that's not so much gift like, it's more
Right,
curse like.
right.
So we are both God's greatest gift and greatest curse.
That's very interesting, right? So
Yeah.
this was talked about by Descartes in his
Hmm.
meditations,
Yeah.
which is that I think it was the third meditation or something like that. We have this infinite capacity, we have this infinite will,
Yeah.
but we are limited in every other aspect, right? So the mind is like the gift of God. Essentially, we take from God this divine ability to think, which is something that you were also talking about, like how amazing the brain is. But we're also limited in our knowledge, right? There's only so much we can know. So we both inhabit both this infinite and this limitedness, which makes us human, right? So we're both gifts of God, but also works of earth or whatever you might call it.
Well, I wouldn't make the leap from gift versus curse idea
Mm-hmm.
straight to the limit versus limitless idea.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was referring to the gift and the curse, I was more referring to our kind of our moral agency
Mm-hmm.
and the capacity of human beings to bring about both beauty and destruction and terror to this world. Like, and but to address that point about limit and limitlessness, like one of
Mm-hmm.
the points Jordan Peterson makes about God is there's an old Jewish critique of God, and I don't know if you've heard this, but the question is, what is the one thing that an all-knowing, all omnipotent, infinite God lacks? And that lack is limitation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, um, within complexity science, or even in artificial intelligence, um, you know, I'm not an expert in any of these things, but there seems to be the idea of the limit seems to be very important, or,
Mm-hmm.
or a body. or something embodied within which the limitless can enter. So yeah, being limitless and all-knowing and omnipotent is great, but your only limit is that you lack limit. You lack a particular perspective, because you're all perspectives. You're everything at once.
Right.
And so yeah, there's this really strange idea that for the limitless, for like, let's say, the heavens to enter into creation, it needs to meet with like a limited being that like arises from the earth, and like symbolically that would represent human beings. Right. And so like in the biblical tradition, the symbolic representation of the limitless meeting the limit is the heavens meeting the earth. So God forming man out of the dust and breathing the air of life into his nostrils. So the union of heaven and earth. And I think that symbolic representation is correct. So I've given you this like line of reasoning saying, all right, we took this 14 billion year journey in order to develop this like super organism, and I don't know, our purpose, the purpose of human beings, or the purpose of this body, is to host the limitless within ourselves. And that's like the idea of an avatar, right? Which I really like. I think that's a really great like archetypal show. And so we have the capacity to do that, but it kind of breaks us. So right. When you have a system, like when you have a complex adaptive system that is like cognitive, so it's able to learn from experiences. So like just like human beings, we're able to learn from experiences and integrate them into our body of knowledge and our understanding of like how the world works, basically. But what happens when we see something that is like so bizarre and so freaking weird that it doesn't just fit in any of our categorical structures? To incorporate that, like the entire categorical structure just kind of disintegrates because you can't contain that. Like imagine I told you, Paul, like right now there's like 14 ghosts floating right behind you, and then you turned around and like saw like 14 ghosts like floating in the air. Like I don't know what your psychological response would be, but like a part of you would be broken because you've seen something so ridiculous and absurd and bizarre that just completely breaks your model of the world. So it's incredibly difficult to like confine the limitless and the infinite. And I think our brains are kind of like a solution to that, because we have two separate systems, let's say, two separate cores or computing cores. The left hemisphere is something like the tendency for order, the tendency to put things into categories, to make things right, to make things certain and absolute. And that is a vital function and property that we use all the time to like schedule our lives, to like move forward, to set goals, to understand the world, to build machines. So like this is a, you know, let me call it like order, or like you can imagine that it's one of the hostile brothers. So it's like Thor. Thor is like the righteous like son of, what's his name?
Odin,
right. And let's say you have the right brain. The right brain is a little bit more tricky So it's not as like localized and certain like in its network as the left brain. The right brain is like the left brain's autistic, weird, younger sibling.
Mm.
So I've talked to you about the split brain experiments, right? So when you've had patients who have like severe epilepsy and you cut their brains in half, just slice through their corpus callosum, like the two brains take on a consciousness and life of their own. And the characteristics of the left are like can be very proud and arrogant and certain, despite any external information. But the right generally stays quiet, and it seems much more anxious or uncertain. But I think there's a lot of other ways to kind of characterize, like through personalities, the kind of mind that the right hemisphere takes on. So the representations of this seem to be something like the right hemisphere is like it's like a question to the certainty and order of the left hemisphere. So when there's something new in that environment that you don't know about, like that poses a question to the integrity of the left hemisphere, to the integrity of like the order that this guy's established. So the right question is like, it's like a slithering snake. It's that snake in the garden that asks like, all right, so like what happens when you eat these mushrooms? It's like, what's going to happen to you? Or it's like Loki, or it's like, it's often described as a trickster. It's like this amorphous, like free thinking, like deceptive, questioning thing. But the thing is that the two work, they're like opponents of each other. They're like the hostile brothers, and they're like this internal drama that we represent in our myths is like our left and right hemisphere just like going at it back and forth, like just bouncing back between like a tendency for order, a tendency for chaos, things like that. So what was I talking about? So
this is the solution you said to
mm-hmm.
how you contain the limitless in limited.
Right. So it's a paradox. Like it's a real strange paradox because you have the left hemisphere and you can't contain the limitless in like a system that only wants to limit things. And for the right hemisphere, it seems to me like a system that can like that can experience the limitless. So for example, when that neuroanatomist suffered a stroke in her left hemisphere, her accounts were like very psychedelic, and she writes about like feeling the energies and becoming one with the room, and like all these weird things. So it seems that the right hemisphere is able to kind of experience and and dabble in the limitness, explore the limitness.
Right.
But dabbling in it isn't the same as like limiting it or containing it. So the solution, I think, is something like when these two poles that have been always fighting and clawing at each other reconcile and form a kind of harmonious union with one another. And I think that this harmonious union between the left and right hemisphere, the union between like Naruto and Sasuke, like that act of reconciliation between the light and the dark, like that is the process by which individuals, the end result of that process is the individual's ability to contain the limitless, to host the limitless like unto themselves, and like basically like contain God, let's say.
So it sounds like you're making a reconciliation between evolutionary theory and what we know of religion, of God, say Christianity, right? So
Yeah.
evolution would tell us this kind of thing happens because it allows for better survival, better propagation of genes, and natural selection, essentially. But at the same time, if you look at it from like a religious perspective, it's saying, well, we're just becoming better and closer to God. We're approximating the best form that could hold and handle what you call, I guess, limitlessness or
Consciousness, being,
consciousness. Right.
or yeah, or the highest form of consciousness.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's very interesting. So you would say that that model, that theory that we have right now of balancing between chaos and order is the ideal?
That's the ideal, but it's never as simple as it's never that simple, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, it makes me think, like, how could we be so arrogant to think that, human beings right now, or that sort of model is going to be the best and is going to be, or sorry, is the best and is going to lead us to a better approximation of the limitless. That's a big claim, right?
exactly. And this fundamental problem, this question, has been playing out in human history for the past 6,000 years. So 6,000 years ago, the first civilizations arose.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say, like, so we know that, like, from archaeological evidence,
Mm-hmm.
around 10,000 years ago, the first modern human beings began the process of agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until 6,000 BC that was it 10,000 BC? So 10,000 BC, and then it wasn't until 6,000 BC until the first city states and civilizations started emerging.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the archaeologists are very, like, baffled by that 4,000-year time gap between the start of agriculture and the beginning of cities, because logically, if you have agriculture developing, and you're able to multiply a population, and the population, like, diversifies in order to meet the demands of the growing population, you get the emergence of something like a city state, like, within, like, maybe 4 or 5 generations, maybe in like 100, 200 years. But that's not what happened. So there's this, like, 4,000-year lag period. And one of the hypotheses is that maybe during maybe like 7,000 or 6,000 BC, there was a kind of, like, breakthrough in the way that human beings, like, processed and understood the world.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, like, very speculative theory, but my theory would be that, okay, maybe at like 7 to 6,000 BC, which would be, like, consistent with the biblical, like, timeline if you trace back all the years they list, you had something like the first woke Homo sapiens to arise. Say that's like Adam and Eve. Say they were, like, wandering their fields and they just picked up a mushroom and, like, had, like, the most crazy trip of their lives that, like, that changed things fundamentally about them. So we know from psychedelics research that after a psychedelic experience, one of the things that changes permanently is your openness, is your personality trait openness. And that trait and other traits, like, of personality are, like, extremely difficult to change with anything. They don't know anything else that can modulate that personality trait and make permanent changes to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can make a fair argument to say that our modern ancestors came across a similar discovery. So in the Bible, or when Jordan talks about, like, the discovery of, like, time, so, like, you're aware of, like, the infinite future, infinite past, and your own mortality. You also become aware of your vulnerabilities and the capacity and even desire for you to exploit those vulnerabilities in others. Like, and that gives you kind of the knowledge of good and evil, or the ability to choose between different paths that lead to different outcomes. So that's described in the Bible as the fall, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fall from innocent and maybe, like, a more harmonious state of being between the left and the right hemispheres to something that, you know, you're awakened, and your eyes are, and your perspective is widened. So maybe there was some kind of inciting event like that at the beginning of our civilizations. So I think that is like a testable claim, but I'll leave it there. I'll leave it to your imagination. And then like what starts happening as those like tribes of people start to get, together and to form like larger complex adaptive systems. There's always a problem. And the first problem you see is like the problem of resentment and jealousy between Cain and Abel, between someone who gets a little bit more and someone who gets a little bit less. That inequality, or like that Pareto distribution, is built into the structure of the world, and you can be resentful against that. But to speed up the story a little bit, you have these complex adaptive systems that are interacting with one another in very different ways, and you're getting clashes and conflicts, and maybe one complex adaptive system is more successful than others. So one tribe and their myth and their whatever leadership style begins to amass like power and begin to really thrive in the world. And then they become sort of big empires and big civilizations. So one of the ones that we're introduced to in the biblical stories is the Egyptian civilization, right? You get to a state where you had that like growth of that complex adaptive system until a point it reaches like rigidity and maturity. So it has lots of economic and military power, and it can sustain itself. But the problem is a lot of people it only benefits a few. So there's a lot of like ingenuity and like developments in like science and art and mythology, and like that's all great, and like you're building huge pyramids, and that's like a wonder. But who are the benefits going to? Like the benefits are going to like the few at a top, like the people who are sovereign and loyal to the sovereign and that inner circle, and then like everyone else is slaves. So that's a big problem. Like you run into, as complex adaptive systems grow and mature, it becomes like a tyranny. So, and the Israelites are people that are like enslaved within that tyranny. And the story is that they have like a very brave and enlightened leader that leads them out of the tyranny. So you can escape that like tyranny of order. And when you leave, the problem is then you have like a tyranny of chaos. So that's represented by the desert. There's literally nothing there, and you don't know where you're going. So like, even though like the trek from Egypt, modern day Egypt, to where they were going, I think it was like Israel. It's like if you did that trek, like Google Maps just walked it, I heard it could be done within like a few months. But they had no idea where they were going, the Israelites, in the desert. So they were wandering like crazy for 40 years, like 39 years and like what 11 more months than you need to. So you start to see the kind of problems they start to run into. How do you, the fundamental question is this: how do you successfully adapt as a complex adaptive system in the world? And complex adaptive system you can interpret as just what? An individual, or like a nation like Israel. Like how is that nation of a complex adaptive system going to adapt in this world? And so I think that's the fundamental question that the wisest and most ethical leaders of Israel started to like ask about. And the way they asked about it was through visionary and spiritual experiences that were accessible through psychedelics. So I've made the case to you before that, yeah, the Bible has maybe like 7 lines on the Tower of Babel and like Cain and Abel, but it devotes like, I don't know, like 4, 5, 6 chapters to the construction and like materials, down to the very details of the tabernacle and like the anointing oil. And that when you trace those ingredients back to like their sources, most of them have psychedelic properties. So it's like actually very reasonable to assume that what these people were doing in the desert each year were a kind of ritualistic communion with like the limitless. Because that's a case I wanted to make to you too, because um, it we don't understand it quite yet, but the action of psychedelics have an effect on like your brain and your perception, such that you are able to experience or see um, the limitless.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's like there's a real strong scientific case to be made for that, in light of what the psychedelic research that's happening today. So you have a situation where these leaders are going to, every year they go into their tabernacle and they take these psychedelics, and the wisdom or the traditions that you receive there help kind of form the written mythology that guides the people, the kind of laws and wisdoms and customs that help the Israelites thrive and stay connected.
Mm-hmm.
So things seem to be good for like Israel, like their God's like chosen people or whatever, and like they have this special access to divine knowledge, and like they're all special. Like what could possibly go wrong, right? But the thing is, so Israel enters into like the land of Canaan, which was their like promised land. So they enter it, they like just slaughter everyone who's there, and they kind of like settle it for themselves, and then they establish their own kingdom. But like you would imagine, like, oh, if they were led by divine knowledge, like of course they'd be, why wouldn't things be great for the rest of time? It's because the Israelite complex adaptive system is prone to this exact same error as that of the Egyptians or the Babylonians or any other empires, because you have a kind of a growth curve they experience as they stabilize and grow. So like in that land, they built their temples. They have like really great kings. Like you have Saul and David and Solomon, and like you've kind of vaguely heard about what they did. But things start to get corrupt through like faulty moral choices of like their kings or their leaders. Like one of the things King David does is like, you know, he sends one of his like most loyal like and brave men to go fight in battle, but in like the first line, so he could have like his girl. Like you know, they're very great kings, but like they have like serious moral faults and errors, and that's not to like disrespect them. That's just a consequence of that being in the heart of like every single human being. But anyways, like there's this constant limitation to what this nation can accomplish, even though they have like access to special divine knowledge and like wisdom, and they have really cool and weird traditions. And the cycle kind of continues over and over again in the Old Testament. So they form a nation, they kind of fall apart, they get captive by like surrounding empires, and then like some prophet comes along and say like, "You're doing things wrong," or "Oh, we should get together and leave." And so you have this cycle of you're either like stabilizing into a nation and then kind of falling apart, being destroyed by other nations, wandering in the desert more, or like being held captive by other empires. And there's this like constant bouncing around between like order and chaos and order and chaos, and there's suffering at both ends. And then like there's this other question or kind of thought that starts to emerge within like the writings of the prophets, right? And they're making like they're starting to formulate a hypothesis about the solution to that constant struggle. And that constant struggle is about, or that hypothesis is something like, in the future there is gonna come like this king figure, the king of kings figures. It's like a meta idea, right? The king of kings, like lord of lords, that's gonna, just take care of every single problem in the world, and like the world will be great for eternity, forever after. So there's kind of like resemblances of that kind of like hypothesis forming within the Israelite wisdom tradition. Um, and then, so what's the solution to that eternal struggle between order and chaos, right? Between our capacity for good and evil, um, and between these like fundamentally opposed forces that are playing out within our psyches, that are playing out like within the history of the world. Like is there a solution to that? And is there a solution to like the extreme inequality, like the kings and like sovereigns getting all the access to all the good things, and slaves and other people being forced at the bottom? Is there a solution to things like if Paul, let's say you had a brother, and like I committed the sin of killing your brother, like what should happen? Like how should I be punished as a consequence? Should I be stoned to death? Should I be killed? But then maybe some of my other family members experience like a very strong pain, and like that doesn't resolve, and that manifests itself as like like I don't know, a will to do something terrible to your family. So and I think this is a very pertinent problem that we're facing right now, the idea of justice. So okay, so like my forefathers or mothers have done wrong to you or your people or at some point in the past, and we've all done wrong to each other, and there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of suffering that comes as a consequence of that. Like what are you going to do about it, right? And retributive justice doesn't seem to be a viable solution, because it can like what because it can kind of spread out infinitely, right?
Right.
So let's say you tax white people like 30% more, to help alleviate the living conditions of the indigenous people here. Maybe that's a great solution, but maybe it creates like a lot of resentment and pain and real suffering in the lives of white people. So like what I'm getting at is that there's a fundamental struggle between order and chaos, between like the law of like punishing people and just letting things go, and like just not caring about it. um like what is the answer to these fundamental questions? And the answer is something like, okay, so let's go back to that example of like when I killed your brother.
Yeah.
So
I don't have a brother, June.
yeah, it's because I killed him.
Yeah.
Another life. So let's say I killed your brother, and you hate me, you despise me, you see me as like the scum of the earth, and you can't understand why I would have done that to your brother.
Mm-hmm.
And your poor brother was like, I don't know, suffering for like 5 days with this stab wound, and then it got infected, and then he just died a very painful and lonely and miserable death.
Yep.
So how am I supposed to reconcile with you and your brother after that's happened? And I can't be here being like all moralistic, being like, oh, like you should just forgive people and love them, like ha ha ha. Because to you and your brother, like that's not a viable solution. Like it doesn't work with your biology. It doesn't work with your sense of fairness or anything in the world, right? But so here might be a solution. So imagine you said to me like June, you motherfucker, like you're a terrible son of a bitch. Um you know what, if you're able to like completely live through like my life and my brother's life in its fullest and endure all the pain and suffering that like I and my brother have experienced, and then you still choose to overcome that and forgive like me, then I will forgive you. Then I'll know that like forgiveness and reconciliation is possible.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the idea here is that maybe you've done something wrong and that's inflicted suffering on someone else. If you're able to take that burden and responsibility and perhaps even like live it through and really understand their suffering like to its core, but still be able to let that go and to forgive and to love someone, then there's hope. Then there's hope, right? Because that's really saying something about the human spirit. It's saying that like no matter how much pain and suffering you've endured, like you're willing to let that go and no longer what multiply that in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a potential solution, and that's the kind of lines of thinking and reasoning that the Israelites were representing in the Old Testament. So a lot of the times they have like within their annual sacrifices, they kill an innocent lamb, and their blood is and the blood of the lamb is supposed to atone for like all the sins of the people for that year. It's a very strange idea, but like when you see a lamb, like you see how peaceful it is. It just lives according to its nature, like very white and fluffy and cute, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
adorable. So it's like it's obvious like why it would be a symbol of, and it can be easily hurted. So obviously it's like a symbol of innocence to people who lived with lambs back in the day, and like the death of that lamb is what reconciles like wrongdoing. So you have the semblances of that kind of idea emerging in the ritual practice of the Israelites. And I think the culmination of that idea into flesh, like the word becomes flesh, is that's the culmination of the Christian story. So the Christian story or the Christian hypothesis goes like this. So you have this terrible problem like that plagues humanity. You have that like fight between order and chaos and all the suffering and resentment that it produces.
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to reconcile that? Is there a way to reconcile these two hostile brothers? And the Christian hypothesis is that that is possible, and the very first human being to do that was this dude in the Middle East. So the case that the Christian story makes is that you have this like brilliant, ingenious child that's born in like Nazareth, and he like from very young age like picks up all the like biblical texts, and he's impressing like all the elders, and like he's like a genius, and throughout his life he never does anything wrong. Like he's as good of a person as you can possibly find like ever, maybe to that point in history. And then that person does a number of strange things, one of them being going into the desert and meditating for 40 days and struggling with his internal demons, with the temptation to run away from maybe his responsibility or his divine duty, which is to be the solution to this like incredible battle that's been going on forever. And he knows that the way he's going to reconcile that is by the most innocent being suffering the most terrible and cruel death imaginable, uh, and yet still being able to forgive and love other people. And so that's the hypothesis, and that's what it says happened. Um, and just over like the past few weeks, like I was always intrigued in that idea as like a hypothesis or a claim. Like, yeah, that would be really cool. Like that would be really cool if something like that really did happen. But in the past few weeks, you can say my threshold for like believing whether that was like historically true, and like the significance of that, it clicked for me. And like that has huge implications on like the way I want to live in the world, and like how I want to carry myself, how I want to learn, and how I want to like treat others. And it's like, yeah, it's weird. It's a weird feeling, but there's some more like I could talk about, but I think my firing power is going down a little bit, so I have to be mindful of that. So I'll let you enter with questions.
That was difficult to follow, I think. So I'll give you some honest feedback. So, in terms of psychedelics, I think there's an issue with thinking of them in the context of the divine, because when I think of psychedelics and when I think of just how the biology of it would work, it seems like all they could do is take what's already there and rewire it differently. So you see different, let's say, combinations of experiences put together. Does that make sense? So really the limitations of what psychedelics can do is take what you know and spin it in a different way and give you new perspectives. And it would be difficult for me to see that as something divine, right? It's divine would be something completely new, or it would be of a different magnitude, I think. So I'm cautious of the use of the word with psychedelics. And I think psychedelics also, what it seems to do is, like you said, it makes you a lot more open, right? A lot more open to experience. And that also has its dangers, I think, because it makes you believe in things that may not be necessarily founded, or that seem to click somehow in some way, but not necessarily grounded in anything solid, at least not yet, right? Maybe when you first take psychedelics, you see all of this, you become introduced to all these ideas, but they're not integrated into your framework or your knowledge base. There were a few points in the middle that I'm trying to jog my memory about. What were the points you were saying? Gosh, if I could remember, should have written these down.
Well, no, I'll address your initial points first.
Sure.
Yeah, no, those are very valid critiques, and the fact that yes, your openness to experience can be cranked up, and so you can you can come across a lot of these like moments of like, wow, I have possession of this like really cool, profound truth, and like I know it to be true, but like the next day when you're like gone from the trip, you're like, what the hell was that all about? Like that was like that doesn't fit in at all with like any of what I know and like hope to integrate. So I just dismiss it because like I don't know what to make of that. The case I would make to you is that I think the kind of things that I've been learning about, and like I've been chasing, like I'm like Alice in Wonderland, right? I'm like chasing that rabbit down like the curiosity hole, and it's like taking me to very strange places. I actually think Alice in Wonderland is a description of like a psychedelic journey. But in any case, like that's what I've been doing, and I've been led to like some very strange experiences, right? And I've like for the past maybe 2-3 years, I've been just like trying to understand it and make sense of it, and to ground it as much as I can, right? Because if you don't have that integration between, you mentioned at the beginning, like between heaven and earth, between the limitless and the limited, then you're just getting like just bullshit. I'm sure I've spilled some bullshit today, but you have to spill some bullshit if you want to find like an inkling of truth, right? So like I've been like just trying to sort through that bullshit and like that like weirdness, and to try to reconcile it with what I understand and know about the world. And I like acknowledge that like my experience in both domains are extremely limited. So like on that point, I wanted to kind of, let's say, think about some next steps, right? Because here's my case. I think my case that like human beings are capable of hosting like the divine, that we have like some kind of almost limitless potential to us. I think there's a very strong case that can be made for that. But the thing is, like, we have no idea how to operate this device. Like, we're really bad at it. Like, we're maybe not even scratching like 1% of the surface potential of what we could do if we like truly mastered our like bodies and our environments. So I'm thinking about like, you know, the Avatar, right? Like the show. So you have this like crazy cool like avatar boy, and he's like really gifted, and like he can do like air bending and stuff, but he has no idea about like the other elements of his life, or the elements that he needs to master in order to contain like that divine and like go into avatar mode and like be super powerful and cool. So there's this developmental journey that needs to happen. And that developmental journey is simultaneously external and internal. So as you go through that phase, you like traverse across the world, learning from like different traditions, and kind of approaches and perspectives to the world. And in that process, you also grow as an individual. You come across like really tough, like, moral, ethical challenges that you need to make the right judgment on. You know, encounter some pretty scary situations that you need to like take courage to face. And there's a real threat. It's like a dangerous game you're playing. But that game is laid open to anyone who wants to pursue it. And like my theory is, and like the Christian theory is, that the first person to like accept and like complete that journey towards like full self-actualization and realization was like Jesus. So he's often referred to as like the Alpha and the Omega. So like he's the first and the last, and like he combines, or he brings unity to like those poles. Like that's the symbol of Jesus within Christian mythology. So that's the first person who did that. And the case that like the New Testament makes is that the disciples were among like the second, the third, the fourth, whatever people to do that, to follow in those kind of same footsteps, to struggle to reconcile with the suffering like within your own heart and like those of others, and to take that plunge into who knows where that journey leads them. And so I think in terms of moving forwards, like that's a question I've been like struggling with. Like, how should I move forwards? Like, what are the steps I should take? And kind of my initial formulations for a solution is something like, well, what you've been doing so far is pretty good. It's pretty good. You're like, I'm pretty curious. I'm learning a lot. I'm taking better and better care of myself. I'm putting my body to work. You're in a good direction. And can you continue that and build on it, and kind of continue that, journey of the individual, of like the avatar, and master kind of all the different elements that, of your being, so that one day you can reach a state where I told you, like, kind of the goal, the ideal state would be to like be dancing through life, right? Like, why don't we dance through life? Why do we walk through life? You know, why? Maybe it's because more energetically efficient, but there you could exist in a state of like kind of flow and harmony where you, I don't know, are just like just jiving with the music of the cosmos. And I think that's a state that is attainable. And so I'm going to work towards that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a really good idea because, like, you're going in a way that is best for you.
Yeah.
Right? It's something that inspires you and keeps you going forward. And I'm not trying to like stifle your creativity or your inspiration at all. Because we work on two different vibes, right? Like we're dancing through life in two different ways.
We are.
So that's why I guess there's a bit of clash in what ideas we want to believe in and what ideas we want to uphold and promote and advocate for.
Uh-huh.
So I think one thing that I do agree with in your approach is that idea of finding something, the needle in the hay, going out, using your curiosity to drive you forward and to find that little bit of inspiration or something interesting that, might give you the new insight or might help people. You never know, right? And the framework that you set out, you described already, but that's how you're going to work through it. And I think all the more power to you, man. And if I were to talk to you next, I think in terms of next steps, right? If I wanted to learn more, is okay. How do you contextualize this so that more people can understand? I think that's the goal that I would maybe posit to you. Is I think you have these ideas and they're great, and it's sometimes difficult for other people who haven't had the similar experiences and haven't gone through the similar thought experiments to also grasp. So how do you root that, and then how do you inspire people to believe in it and understand what you're putting out there?
So I have a comment, a potential solution to that too. Because I've thought about this also during like my marijuana trip. Like we can communicate by talking to each other, right?
Yeah.
But like that has so many potential sources of error. Like the error can come from like when I'm talking, the error can come through like when you're receiving it.
Yeah.
And that error compounds, and like it's not a great way, even if you have like two masterful like listener and talkers to convey information. There are other ways to convey information, like images and symbols, that is a little more vague and ambiguous. But if people have enough of a common understanding as to like what that symbol represents, like if they all share like the same meme, then like you're able to get that like instantly and be provided with like a large sum of information that couldn't be contained in one word. And also narratives. And the other thing that I've learned is when you communicate things in more than one sense, the more likely you're able to like identify the core pattern of what that is. So like I could say to you the word hot, but like if I also give you an image of fire and like maybe like a VR experience of like I don't know, putting fire against your I don't know person. So the more modalities I give you to understand or to sense the information that I'm trying to deliver to you, the more successful you're going to be at it, and the more lasting and impressionable it's going to be.
Yeah.
I've thought about this, like how do you best, if you think you have like a kind of information that's like really important and that really needs to be represented correctly, how would you do it? Like, I don't know, like the best way that the Jews could do it in ancient times was to write. And that's like a very primitive 2D technology, and it can't represent much. And you also had art, but there's limitations to that. And I think people are experimenting with filmmaking and pushing the boundaries of storytelling and conveying information. So I think like the future is like limitless in terms of like if you could create a VR, like a 4D experience of a story, and you actually get to live through it, like imagine how compelling and memorable that could be, right?
Right.
So I think what I need to work towards is learning how to convey information in a better, more compelling way. And that's not just going to be through words. It might be through technology. It might be through images. It might be through video.
Well, I think that, like, I totally agree with you. I think you hit the nail on the head there. And I think one of the reasons why maybe human beings are becoming smarter, or our IQs are becoming higher over time, is because we have so much more information in different ways. And I'm sure this is part of like learning theory or cognitive theory, that the more you're exposed to something in different modalities, as you say, the better we are at remembering it. And that's my approach to like medical school right now, is to get as many different sort of sources as I can: video, textbook, actual going out and seeing anatomy, for example.
Right.
All of these things help to contribute understanding. So it's definitely useful. One thing that that you haven't said is knowing your audience, right? And knowing the language and the sort of ideas that your audience has, so that you can work with that to get your message across. And this is something we know through like communications, we know through theater, we know through art, right? You have to know your audience. So maybe
and that's another like kind of fundamental challenge I think I've been struggling with, because we're living in like such a multiplicity of cultures and traditions and ways of life and ways of viewing the world, that like sometimes it seems impossible to get across to like someone else. I don't know, do we even share the same language? Because the more I grow up, the more I realize like people have radically different lives and upbringings than me.
Oh yeah.
And culture is a big part of that. And I know we discussed that a little bit in the car ride back from Ottawa. But yeah, it's like you try to go somewhere and then you hit these like boundaries or limitations, and the challenge is, how do you overcome that? And how do you like really understand someone else's perspective and experiences, so that you can connect to them in their language?
Well, it's a tough question, and it's it'll make you a cosmopolitan if you're able to figure that out. Yeah. So let's keep at it. I'm gonna cut us off as I promised. I gave you a little more time than I initially intended. But I hope you got a chance to explore your thoughts. I hope the audience got a chance to follow in, and hopefully they took something out of it too. Maybe someone out there is thinking similar to you, and you guys really connected. So,
but I doubt they'll listen to this 1 and whatever hour ramble.
We never know who's going to listen to this and when they're going to listen to it.
I will refine the message.
There you go. So look forward to that. All right. Thank you for listening.
Peace out.